Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
So we are still looking at data frames in R, and here is the data frame that we had developed in the last module. We have name, month, blood sugar, and blood pressure. And again, just to reiterate the idea, the data frame can be developed using the data.frame command as shown in this slide. Now, there might be cases where you want to recast this data frame in different formats so that some of the algorithms are easier to implement, or you might want to get statistics of things that are different, for example. So in this case, if you look at this data frame at the top, you have a name, you have a month, and you have the blood sugar and blood pressure of that person for those month, January here. And the second data tells you Sindhil in February had 139.3 as blood sugar and 78 as blood pressure, and so on. Now, you might be interested, for example, in seeing how the blood pressure and blood sugar of Sam and Sindhil changed over time. So you might want to change the data frame to another format where, if you notice, Sam and Sindhil have become two identifiers for whom the data is given. So it might be useful to look at the data in a slightly different recasted format. So there are two ways of doing this, and we are going to see these two ways. This is a very important idea if you're working with very, very large data sets and then you want to visualize them differently, or you want to handle them differently, and so on. So the way you do it is through two steps. Let me discuss that first, and then later I'll show you how you can do both the steps with a single command. So the first command is called the melt, and then once you melt the data frame, then you can cast it in any which way you want. So originally we started with this data frame on the left, which is Sindhil, Jan 141.290, and so on. So what we are going to do is we are going to melt this, and then we are going to assign variables, blood sugar and value. So in the data frame that you have, blood sugar and blood pressure were in the same rows. What we have done is, by melting this data frame, we are getting the blood sugar and blood pressures in the different rows. So for example, if you see the data frame originally, it has only 4 rows with blood pressure and blood sugar as 2 columns. The melted data frame now has 8 rows because this variable has been separated out. And once you do this, then you can cast it in the form that you want. So we have to see how we do this melt, and then we have to see how we do this cast. Now, before we do that, we'll just point out that we are going to use the name and month as identifier variables, and blood sugar and blood pressure as a measurement variables. So for each of the identifier variables, these would become values that are stored in a data frame. So we can use the melt command with data frames to do the first activity. As I mentioned before in the last slide, we said the identification variables are the name and month, and we say ID variables are name and month, and we said the measurement variables are blood sugar and blood pressure. We say measurement variables are blood sugar and blood pressure, and we use the melt command as shown here, and you see that the data frame has changed. Now you have 8 rows instead of 4 rows, and the first 4 rows are pertaining to the blood sugar, and the last 4 rows are pertaining to blood pressure. Now, once you do that, then the next step is to cast it in the way we want. So the command for that is dcast, and the way you do this is the following. So what you're saying is, variable and months are already variables that are there. Variable is blood sugar or blood pressure, month has February or January. Now, instead of saying Sam and Sindhil as just names, we are going to convert them also as variables. So every instance of the name is converted as a variable, and a new column is assigned to it. So the syntax is variable plus month is already variables, and then I'm going to say name is also a variable. From the previous data frame, what has happened here is there is a new column for Sam and there's a new column for Sendal. Now that you have these, you need to fix the values for this. Basically, the values are the blood pressure and blood sugar values from the previous table. That's what this command says. And then you see that the data frame has been recasted in a different form where you have the format that you are interested in. You could also do both of this in one command, which is called recast, which is a combination of melt and cast. And this command combines both. The syntax is straightforward. You have a data frame, and there has to be a melt portion of the command and a cast portion of the command. And remember, in the melt portion, we had to identify the identification variables, and that's what we give here in terms of id.variable is name and month. These are the two identification variables. And in the cast command, we had to tell the program what are the new variables that come out of the casting. So here again, name was Sam and Sendil. These are two new variables we want as casting. So we say tilde name. So you see that Sam and Sendil come out. So this is one command which does both melt and cast. Now, much like the list, you can also add, subtract to data frames. Here is an interesting example that you want to do. Basically, you have your blood pressure values. Supposing you were able to understand this blood pressure much more in a log scale, for example, then what you could do is you can mutate this data frame and then add another column. So a simple syntax is mutate. The first element is the data frame that you want to mutate. And then the extra column that you're adding, you have to give the formula here, which says log BP is log of BP. And you see the result on the console output. You have a new column which is log BP, which is simply taking log of BP. So it is also possible to combine data frames. But now it's interesting, there are many data frames which might be disparate, which might be the same. So when we combine these data frames, how do we combine this? So the way to do combine in R is to basically say what is going to be used to combine these data frames. So the function is very simple. You have a data frame 1, data frame 2, and it says you combine them through a particular ID variable. Now this ID variable is common to both the data frames. So here is an illustration. Let's say I have one data frame which has ID 1, 2, and corresponding to the ID there is a name and an age. Let's say I have another data frame which also has the ID, but it doesn't have the name and age information, but it has information regarding the gender. Now, since the ID is a common variable, instead of using these two data frames, it might be worthwhile to use one data frame where all this information is consolidated. So if we use this data frame consolidation using ID variable, you will get a new data frame which consolidates the information of name, age, and gender in a single data frame. There are several ways of combining. There are several commands that you can use. We'll go through a few of these, and we're going to have some of these as exercises for you to work out and then see what happens here. The interesting thing with all of these commands is the following. There could be an ID variable which has certain elements in one data frame but does not have certain elements in other data frame. So the clear question that one needs to ask when one is trying to combine these data frames is, when there is missing information, what happens to the combine? How does R handle this? So it's what we want to see in the next module.